Welcome, everyone. I'm Mei Chang, CEO of Candid. And I want to thank you all for joining us today to talk about how we can use demographic data to advance equity in the social sector. As you may know, just over a year ago, we launched Demographics via Candid because we're seeing a dramatic increase in demand for demographic data from nonprofits. So we had two goals in mind. One was simply to reduce the burden being placed on nonprofits, and two, to give us all real data and insights on where things stand when it comes to equity. Candid's been collecting demographic data for 5 years now, with more than 66,000 nonprofits sharing their demographic data with us. And now with Demographics via Candid, we're building a movement by asking everyone who's collecting demographic data about nonprofits to ask for it through the Candid profile. In return, our commitment is to make that data freely available in multiple formats as a public good. So today, nearly 140 partners have now signed on as Demographic via Candid partners. And I want to take a moment to thank all of you pioneers who joined us early, and also thank all of you who are here today to learn about Demographics via Candid and how you can join us. We're also delighted that we're partnering with 6 major grants management systems, or GMSs, that serve more than half the market. That means that most foundations can seamlessly leverage Candid's demographic data in their applications or reporting. Today, we're excited to host a panel discussion with 2 partners who are using Demographics via Candid to advance their own work on equity. We'll also share a sneak peek at some early insights from the demographic data that we've collected to date. But first, to start out, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Akilah Watkins, President and CEO of Independent Sector, an organization that brings together nonprofits, foundations, and corporations to strengthen civil society. They're also a Demographics via Candid partner. I think Akilah is one of the most inspiring leaders in our sector, and I'm honored to serve on Independent Sector's board. So with no further ado, Akilah, if you won't mind coming on screen, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Mei, for that warm welcome and for Candid's continued IS membership. Mei is also on our board, like she mentioned, and we're so appreciative of the important leadership role that you play. And thank you for Candid for providing space in your New York office last year to host independent sectors listening to our New York City. We deeply appreciate it. I am going to make a quick plug for our listening tour, which we began about a year ago. I wanted to hear directly about the challenges our sector and organizations are facing, as well as trends and opportunities. To date, we've spoken to more than 500 organizations across this country. We're concluding the tour with a virtual session on March 20th to get feedback from as many people as possible, including about our shared work on equity. I encourage you to participate by registering on independentsector.org. Now, let's talk about the equity climate in the United States. In one word, the current equity crisis in our country is sobering. As you may know, last June, the Supreme Court issued rulings that struck down affirmative action at U.S. colleges and universities. The rulings raised profound concerns for the nonprofit and philanthropic sector, including concerns about an impact on how we collect and apply demographic data. The Supreme Court's decision also stoked fears about additional challenges to diversity, equity, and inclusionary efforts. And those fears are coming to fruition. In December, the independent sector filed an amicus brief together with the Council and Foundations in support of the Fearless Foundation. The foundation is a Black woman-led organization that helps combat underfunding in venture capital. It does this by providing grants, tools, and mentorship for Black female entrepreneurs. The Fearless Fund is facing a baseless lawsuit from the American Alliance for Equal Rights because the Fearless Fund makes grants to Black women entrepreneurs. We believe any argument that discriminates helping Black women gain opportunity in a field where they have been historically underrepresented not only ignores the history of our nation, but also present reality. That is why women entrepreneurs of color are experiencing such a significant gap in venture capital funding. If successful, the lawsuit would unconstitutionally limit Fearless Foundation's expression of its values, and it would have a chilling effect on philanthropy as a whole, especially on our work toward equity. Philanthropic giving is voluntary. Efforts to curtail or control the causes or people donors can support will disincentivize them from giving at all, with severe consequences for communities and charitable causes across the country. And let's be clear, giving that supports hate is not philanthropy. Philanthropy has a duty to ensure that charitable dollars never support organizations that promote hate, extremism, or violence. But it wouldn't stop there. This lawsuit against a grant program for Black women entrepreneurs could cause other DEI and social change efforts across all sectors to come under threat. To drive transformative change, we need both courage and structural solutions. And philanthropy has a critical role to play. Nonprofits need grant makers and foundations to champion their missions and put resources behind nonprofit advocacy through unrestricted funding and general operating support. Nonprofits also need grant makers to double down on philanthropic commitments to racial justice and to provide the resources that enable their grantees to advocate for and measure policies that advance equity. Now, data can provide critical information about equity or the lack thereof. For example, a recent independent sector report shows Black and Hispanic workers, especially Black and Hispanic women, are paid less on average to work full-time in the nonprofit sector than are other workers. The gaps are even larger in the for-profit sector. Pay disparity statistics are one way to assess the cumulative impact of overlapping systems of bias. By the time someone enters the workforce, their life, their job, and their pay have been shaped by numerous factors, like their access to education. Access to education is strongly influenced by neighborhood segregation and gaps in intergenerational wealth. And once someone enters the workforce, racism and sexism can affect their career trajectory in ways both large and small. And those impacts can add up over time. A typical Black woman in the nonprofit sector is paid 21% less than the average pay for the sector as a whole. A single statistic like this one cannot stand in for the lived experience of millions, but it can be a vital starting point for discussions about how we move toward a more equitable sector. In our upcoming collaboration with United for Alice, independent sector will focus on workers in the nonprofit sector who live paycheck to paycheck and struggle to build economic security for themselves and their families. Disaggregated data on this segment of the nonprofit workforce, including race, age, gender, access to healthcare, and whether children are in the home, will help us build a more informed picture of who is struggling and why. This will inform our work to improve policies affecting the nonprofit workforce. It will also guide the programs and resources that we build for nonprofit organizations. Of course, it's also important to consider how we collect data and measure results. If nonprofits aren't deliberate about how we collect, store, and communicate data, we risk harming groups that already experience inequality. In closing, Demographics via Candid was created to reduce the demographic data request burden on nonprofits while helping grant makers better understand their portfolios, identify gaps, and provide data to support informed giving decisions. At IS, we have long known two things. One, good and timely data that models data collection best practices is a critical tool for advancing the large causes of equity. And two, data can be misused and must be carefully protected to ensure against unintended use. We see this Candid effort as walking a very careful line between these two realities, and we are very supportive of this work. Demographics via Candid will make the most impact when more funders sign on, reduce their demographic data request, and give nonprofits back precious time needed to focus more fully on their missions. I want to congratulate Candid on your 1-year anniversary of the establishment of demographics via Candid. And a little birdie told me that 2024 is the 5th year anniversary of the merging of GuideStar and Foundation Center to become Candid. Congratulations on that as well. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you all today. I'm going to turn things back over to Ann-Mei to begin the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akilah, for joining us and for those really, really important perspective. And now I want to open a conversation with our panelists. So I want to invite our panelists to come on screen. And please join me in welcoming Cat Clerkin, our Associate Vice President of Research and Insights here at Candid, Huilan Kren, Director of Learning and Impact at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and George Ibarra, Interim Vice President of Programs at the Weingart Foundation. Thank you all for joining us today. So I want to start with Cat. Everybody's really eager to see the data. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about the data that Candid has collected and share some of the early insights that we're starting to see.
Hey, Ann-Mei. Yeah, absolutely. Lots of exciting things to share. So I'm going to dive right in. I've got some slides because, you know, visuals are worth a lot of words when it comes to data. So first of all, to answer your question about like what's been happening with the data collection the last year, huge news. Since DVC launched last year, 1,000 new nonprofits have shared demographic data each month, which is just kind of an astounding number to me. Overall, our data set is about 66,000 nonprofits strong. And the majority of those have last updated their demographic data in the last year. So this data is very up to date and really reflects what we know about the sector right now. Another, exciting update is that my team has put together some resources for others who want to dig into the data. We know that this is something, right? It's a common good that we're sharing. Other people are trying to understand what's in the data. So I think that these resources are in the chat, but we created an FAQ that highlights a lot of questions you might have about the data and gives you some answers about how representative is the data, how do we collect the data, what kind of data do we have. And then a research manual that digs a little deeper for people doing analysis and want to understand things like response attrition, data limitations, changes to the data over time. So please check those out. My team worked really hard on them. And then when it comes to insights and what we're learning, the data is so huge and rich and robust. I think we've probably looked at 100 different analyses at this point. But for the few minutes I have today, I just want to highlight 5 insights that I think can inform your racial equity journey specifically. And hopefully this will spark some discussion as we dive into our panel. So the first insight is that there is still a racial leadership gap in the sector. When we looked at all of the data overall, which represents nearly 1 million nonprofit workers, we saw that our sector is actually pretty diverse when it comes to race. There's actually a majority or a minority of people who identify as white in the overall sector. But when we look at people in CEO positions, the story changes quite a bit. The majority, 70% of nonprofit CEOs are white. And so this suggests that there's, a racial inequity perhaps in our leadership pipeline, which we might want to further understand and look into. The second insight has to do with context. And so we know that the US is a very kind of diverse and large country, and representativeness, the underlying representativeness of the country shifts a lot. So we wanted to look at that 70% across the US. And so this map right here actually looks at the percent of white adults in the US by state according to the census. And this looks at what the CEOs of our sector look like. And as you can see, white CEOs are overrepresented compared to the underlying population in just about every state to varying degrees. And what's interesting is some of the more diverse states, places like California, Texas, Hawaii, those are actually where we're seeing some of the biggest gaps. And so while we do see more non-white CEOs in those states, we're also seeing big gaps there. So I think the takeaway here is that understanding context is important when we're on our racial equity journey. And when we're trying to understand representation, it's important to keep that in mind. My third takeaway is some analysis that we've done to try to understand the race and gender financial resource gap. We all know that resources and it's important in the sector. That's how we get things done. And so we did actually an intersectional analysis looking at CEO, race, and gender by revenue size. And what we found is that white CEOs, white male CEOs run a relatively small proportion of small organizations, but a larger proportion of large organizations. And in contrast, women of color run a lot of the smaller organizations and fewer of the large organizations. So, I think the takeaway here is that racial equity is intersectional, and that even though we are seeing more diversity among smaller organizations, a lot of the power and resources of the sector are still disproportionately staying in the hands of white men. And this gap becomes even more notable if we look at organizations with majority BIPOC leadership. So in this analysis, what we did was we looked at organizations with a BIPOC CEO and a majority BIPOC board, compared them to organizations with a white CEO and a majority white board. And we found that there is a 35% gap in average revenue between those two different kinds of organizations. Again, I know I'm full of good news. So basically what we're, learning from this is that when there is a stronger collective of BIPOC voices in leadership positions, it also seems to be met with fewer resources. And finally, this one's a little bit of a teaser because this kind of highlights some of the directions that my team is going on in this coming year. There also seems to be a racial grant gap. And so to explain this bar a little bit, what we found was that when it comes to organizations with white CEOs, 82% of them received at least one grant in the last 5 years. In contrast, organizations that have a CEO of any other race were less likely to receive at least one grant in the last 5 years. Now, I'll say the caveat is this is kind of an ongoing analysis and there's a lot more to unpack. But I think what it really highlights is that race is a factor when it comes to equity, when it comes to access, when it comes to resources in the sector, and all of the things that data can do to help us understand what gaps exist and hold us accountable to then do something about it. And that's what I got. Back to you, Anne-May.
Thank you so much, Kat. Kat can attest that I'm always knocking on her door virtually to say, hey, what new analysis do you have? It's amazing to have all this data for the first time and be able to get insights like this. And her and her team are going to be publishing more about this throughout the year. So I want to turn to Hui Lan. Hui Lan, thank you for being a champion of demographics via Candid. I'd love if you could talk about the Equity Data Workgroup. What is it? How did it get started? And how you've been collaborating with Candid on it?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Anne-May. It has been a privilege to be a partner with Candid. Before I talk about the work group, I would like to talk a little bit about the Akilah Foundation. My role has a lot to do with data. Among all the data, demographic data about our grantees is essential. We started collecting demographic data from grantees in 2013, and we create trends, annual trend on how many nonprofit EDs or CEOs are people of color, and how much funding they receive from us, disaggregated by race and ethnicity. We began our partnership with Candid, as Candid data gives us the bigger picture, that I call it a data universe of the nonprofit leadership diversity. You saw that from past presentation. The bigger picture and the deeper dive in our grantee portfolio help us understand and learn about what our grantees do and who they are and what support that they need from us so that they can better serve children and families in our communities. So more broadly, as data plays a bigger part in my role, I'm naturally drawn to data reports such as APIP publication, I think titled Seek to Soar or Seeking to Soar. That report used the Candid data to show foundation funding and the funding trend for API communities. It is very disheartening for me to learn that only 0.2% of foundation funding went to support API communities. So as a foundation employee, I wanted to do something. As the lead of our data and the evaluation work, I wanted to do something about data. So I connected with a few foundation evaluation leaders, and together we decided to form a community of action. We call ourselves the Philanthropy Data Equity Workgroup. Our workgroup's aim is to tackle some of the toughest issues around data, especially around demographic data, so that we can help facilitate the sector transformation journey and then transforming the sector to become more effective, efficient, more equitable, and more transparent. So to do something about demographic data, we needed a data partner. Around the time when the work group was formed, we heard some exciting buzzes around demographics via Candid campaign, and we reached out to Candid. Candid seems to be the best positioned to collaborate with the work group to explore the why demographic data, what about demographic data, and so what about the demographic data, because we share three things in common. The first one is high alignment between our shared aim to transform the sector as a whole, to make it less individual foundation-centric and ease the burdens on nonprofit grantee organizations or potential grantee organizations. Our collective commitment to advance equity is our second thing in common. Lastly, the work group is very moved and motivated by the courage that Candid showed to create a data platform that specifically promotes equitable funding practices for all. So after a couple of months of speed dating, Candid and the work group became fast partners in our joint journey to pursue racial equity.
Thank you so much, Hoilan. It's been great. The partnership has really been powerful and fantastic, and looking forward to discussing it more. I want to turn to Joyce. Joyce, the Weingart Foundation has been a longtime partner of Candid, and we've worked together to increase transparency and reduce grantee burden. So I'm wondering if you could share a bit about the Weingart Foundation's journey in collecting demographic data and how you're collaborating with other funders across California.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning / afternoon, everyone. So we at the foundation have always collected this information in some form, but mostly in a qualitative way, really to engage in conversation with partners and potential partners during our due diligence process. The data was often discussed with the lens of diversity and cultural competency as critical elements of organizational effectiveness. And the data actually became more essential to us when we made an explicit commitment to equity in 2016, again, paralleling a little bit of what Hoilan was talking about. It was through that equity commitment that we became more intentional about understanding how folks with lived experience contributed to decision-making and strategic roles at the organizations that we partnered with. And that intentionality really deepened through the pandemic, given its disproportionate impact on communities of color, through the racial reckoning of 2020, and through our own journey as a foundation that was committed to racial equity and racial justice. And it was in that evolution that we acknowledged maybe qualitative data wasn't the only way, or wasn't as full of a picture of what we wanted to know. We recognized that we needed a more systematized way to collect and aggregate the demographic data of our partners so that we can better understand whether our grant making with this equity commitment aligns with the priorities we set out to support BIPOC communities and people, organizations, and other communities that are historically excluded from philanthropy. So in 2021, we came together with colleagues at the California Endowment and the James Irvine Foundation, who were also grappling with this need for a systematized way of collecting this data. And we enlisted the help of Viewpoint Consulting and Kelly Brown, and many of you know Kelly as a preeminent expert in all things diversity within our field, and in particular regarding the intersection between demographic data and philanthropy. And the goals of our collaboration at the time, it was very heartening to hear that they mirror the goals of both what Mei talked about and Milan. How do we make it easier to collect and use demographic data, and how do we use that data to promote greater equity in the distribution of philanthropic resources? So as three foundations that had an explicit commitment to racial equity, we saw the opportunity to align our approach to demographic data collection as a way not only to reduce burden on our partners, but also hold ourselves accountable to our individual and collective goals around equity. We shared a lot of grantee partners because we live in the same geographic footprint, and we knew there was a lot of overlap in our funding priorities. And our process really included a significant effort to survey and focus group grantee partners because we were deeply concerned about centering their needs and minimizing the burden to them. We learned a lot through that process, including that a majority of our nearly 400 survey respondents and focus group participants already collect and report this data, but that they did so to nearly 100 different entities, and of course, not in a uniform way. We also learned that there was a desire for a standardized approach, and that there was a need for tools and capacity building, including a call for shared data analysis as a field. And I can touch upon later about how we address some of those needs. And when we started this effort, the endowment was the only one of our foundations that was collecting this information, and they were doing so using the Candid GuideStar profile. And we at the Weingart Foundation saw the benefit of that because we saw that data, through that effort. But what our joint effort ultimately led to was a targeted campaign that happened to align with the Demographics via Candid campaign among our three foundations, so that we explicitly requested that our partners submit their demographic data through Candid. And for us at the Weingart Foundation, this was a new endeavor for us, but it proved very fruitful. We saw an increase in the percentage of our grantees that had any demographic data in Candid go from roughly 50% to nearly 80%. And these are among organizations that have EINs and can submit their data to Candid. We also had a separate sort of survey going for non-EIN groups, and we saw that nearly 2/3 of our partners that were non-EIN submitted some form of data, particularly on the race, ethnicity, and gender of their board and their leadership. So we're still in data collection mode. We haven't gotten to the step of using this data yet, but we continue to be in conversation with the endowment and with our partners at the James Irvine Foundation about how we collectively want to think about this data, but we're also open to speaking to any partners who are willing to join us, particularly those of you based in California.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Really exciting to see the traction that demographic data collection is getting across California. Huilan, I want to turn back to you. As you know, one of the goals of Demographics via Candid is to create a standard way of collecting demographic data for the sector. So how is this relevant to the goals of the data equity work group? And what do you see as the benefits of us all aligning on our demographic data collection?
Absolutely. Great question. Thank you, Mei. I'm a student. I always start with a definition. I remember a federal government agency defines data standard as that is a agreed upon system that allows for consistent measurement. I very resonated with that definition. I was thrilled when I learned that one of the premises of Demographics via Candid is to have a data standard. Why is this premise relevant to the work group? Earlier, I talked about the work group's aim to handle or tackle some of the toughest issues around data. So this data standard premise ties directly to one of our work group's goals of creating a common definition for POC-led organizations, POC serving projects / programs / organizations / initiatives for sector benchmarking purposes, so we can compare apples to apples. Having a common definition can help create that specific aspect of a data standard around what to measure. The what to measure signifies what data to collect that matters to us. Once a data standard on what data to collect is determined, it will guide on how to collect the data and by whom. Clarifying what demographics data to collect, how to collect the data, who is the data source are a few of the anticipated benefits when demographic data collection is aligned. In a way, it is actually an equity play because data power is the power that is around who the data comes from, who collects the data, how the data is used, by whom. So that whole thing is part of the power building. For me, another significant anticipated benefit of aligning on demographics data collection is the increased likelihood of having consistent, systematic, and quality data from and about our current and future grantee partners. Of course, aligning on demographic data collection is not the be-all and end-all, but at least it is a very tangible way to ease the burden on nonprofits to get good data.
Thank you, Hoilan. And back to Joyce. Joyce, so what advice would you give to funders who are just starting their journey of collecting demographic data from their grantees?
The first it would be no need to reinvent the wheel. As Philan said, there are taxonomies out there and they exist and they were already developed with good thinking. And it's important to know what is the data you need at a baseline level to really assess for action versus what is nice to know and really, focus on the former. Secondly, I would say from our experience, it was really important for us to build buy-in internally with our team and to provide the language and tools to our frontline staff who engage most with the nonprofit partners. So that was both grant making and grants management team. Program officers, at least in my camp, are very protective of their grantees. And within the context of implementing a trust-based approach to grant making, this was a tricky sort of situation to ask. But once we talked about the why of the data, that it's important for our own learning and action, that helped to build support. The question we posed is, how do we know what our impact is if we don't even know who we're impacting? And so that went a long way. And it also helped that when we shared what we learned through our process, that grantees are already collecting this data, so it's not that much of a burden to ask them to do so in this way. And in doing so in this way is helping to build field-wide alignment on a shared approach. And so that went away. It's also important, I feel, we felt to be transparent and communicate clearly with our grantee partners. For us, I think for sure it was a motivating factor that we aligned this campaign with 2 other California-based funders that either already are their funders or could potentially be their funders. And so I think that was a highly motivating factor. And then in our case in particular, we requested this data once grants were approved. So the perceived notion that the data could be used, in a decision-making way from our grantees, I think was taken away because of our particular approach to when we collected that data.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And with that, I'm going to turn to questions that were pre-submitted by some of our attendees. I'm going to start with one that I hear quite often, which is about the Supreme Court ruling. As Akilah talked about, there was a Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action in higher education last year. And there's been a lot of talk about whether that ruling could one day apply to grant making. So the question is if any of you are concerned about this, given that you are collecting demographic data and using it to guide your equity work. And I want to share 3 quick thoughts on my end before turning it over to the panelists, taking the moderator's prerogative here. I would say, first of all, the key words are could one day. I think it's important to recognize that this ruling only applied to higher education, so because we don't want to create a chilling effect and kind of stop doing things that are fully legal today. Beyond that, I think that even in the worst case scenario where a similar ruling might in the future apply to philanthropy, I believe that what we're doing to collect demographic data will be equally, if not more important. And that's because it's going to be critical for us to have visibility where there's evidence that the current practices we have are leaving some behind so we can take corrective action. And the demographic data allows us to see where those gaps are. The other piece is that even in that worst case scenario, I think we're going to want to be able to, and it will never, I think, become illegal to proactively source nonprofits from underserved organizations and underserved demographics. So I truly believe that, one, we shouldn't get ahead of the law here, and the things that we're doing today are very much legal and that are going to be beneficial even if the law changes in the future. So Huilan, Joyce, Akilah, do any of you guys want to weigh in on how you're thinking about kind of where we are with the Supreme Court ruling and how that affects your work?
My answer is very short and simple. It's very reflective, basically, of what you shared on May. We haven't been told yet that anything we're doing is illegal. And if anything, it is compelling us to stand more strongly in our equity stance. And so, we haven't changed anything. We're not shying away from it. We do proactively source our grantees, and we use data to inform where we find gaps in our mission and who we're hoping to prioritize. So yes, what I would say would be an exact repeat of what you just shared on May in terms of why we should continue on with what we're doing.
For us at the Kellogg Foundation, I think the ruling came at a time when many racial equity practices and the policies are under attack. In the face of these attacks, we're not wavering from our commitment to our grantees, partners, and the communities. And we're also not staying away from our 7 racial equity standards, with one of them being everybody counts. We always seek to disaggregate demographic data by race and ethnicity so that it's not creating others, even if the collecting the data is not convenient or less convenient at times. So we continue collecting demographic data as part of the information bank to help us draw strength and hope from the creativity, persistence, and the inspired actions of the people fighting on the front line for racial equity. And I think it's just a way to say that we are not going to stop. We are not stopping the fight. We are not stopping collecting the data and use the data.
That's great, Huilan. Akilah, do you have anything you'd like to add here?
Yeah, so I think a few thoughts. I really appreciated you sort of highlighting one day, right? So, I think part of the threat is not even sort of the current sort of legal environment. While, that's more toxic than we would all want it to be. What it does, what the ruling did, the Supreme Court ruling did, is it created sort of this feeling in the sector that something could happen, that you could be sort of attacked for your DEI work. And even if that never transpires, the fact that we are sort of focused on the sort of range of possibilities takes away from work that we should be doing. And so I think convenings like the one we're doing now with Candid are important because they give a counter narrative. I think some people will want to believe that the nonprofit sector, isn't going to sort of stand firm and fight and really have some fidelity towards a value system, that we have co-created over the last sort of 40 years or so. And I just really am optimistic when I hear philanthropic leaders especially say, we're going to stand in this place and we're going to continue our mission. And I think we need more of that. We need to play more of a defensive stance as opposed, we need to sort of be more offensive as opposed to waiting for the other shoe to drop. So, I think it was important for us to weigh in via our amicus brief with the Fearless Foundation, because that's an example of how the Supreme Court decision can seep into the nonprofit sector. And those are the things we want to make sure that doesn't continue and spread like wildfire. So it was important for us to file, a legal, our amicus brief with the court. So they had an idea of how the sector sort of weighed in on this topic. And I think doing more of that and then educating foundations about best practices, how they do their work better, whether or not they should do their own legal review. Again, these are things we should just do as part of good housekeeping. But I am very just elated by the conversation today around how foundations are sort of staying committed to the long term.
Thank you, Akilah. It's great to see the unanimity here about like all systems go. Like, this we have to continue to stay focused on what we're doing. I'm going to turn back to Cat here and ask Cat I'm going to merge a couple audience questions together here. How does Candid determine what questions to include in our demographic data survey? And how do we review the questions and the options that are available? And then I'm going to add on to that another question, which is, are we gathering or planning to gather demographic data on international and fiscally sponsored organizations?
Ooh, okay, that's a lot. I'm going to go and see if I can remember that and go one by one. As far as how do we determine what demographics to collect, carefully, I think is the answer. We're trying to really strike this balance of making sure that we're asking the questions that are most needed by the sector, but not asking so many questions that it becomes a new burden, right? Like a lot of the theme of today is how can we decrease the burden on nonprofits? And so while we know that there's lots of different demographic categories and then also responses to demographic categories, we're trying to kind of walk the line of collecting the ones that are most often requested without being too burdensome. And the other thing to keep in mind is that we know identities continue to evolve and language continues to evolve. And so we know that our standard won't be the standard forever. We will have to continue to iterate and update. We have, since we started our demographics collection journey, changed some of the wording a couple of times, but we're also trying to be careful about that, because if we change our wording every year, then it also creates more burden for folks collecting it. We've been doing this in partnership. So, shout out to D5, Change Philanthropy, Kelly Brown, who was mentioned earlier, all of the different folks who have worked with us to make sure that we continue to use best practices and focus on collecting the data that matters most. And then the other question about fiscal sponsored organizations and programs, that is in our roadmap of something we're working on. Right now, it's challenging to get around if you don't have an EIN, how do we, make sure that you can claim a Candid profile and all of that. That is something that we're working on. Once we kind of get some technical things sorted out, then you will be able to claim your profile, and then collecting and sharing demographic data becomes much easier. In the meantime, we do encourage funders to collect that data. Joyce, you've mentioned that for fiscally sponsored organizations, you do help them with that. I think that that's awesome. And then international data, I think, was the last piece. That piece is, I think, really important to us, and also maybe the hardest. There is no unified global demographics that makes sense in every single country, and that is safe in every single country, right? Like there are countries where collecting information about LGBTQ groups, has a death sentence. And so we're trying to be really careful, very conscious, and exploring what makes sense to go beyond the US.
Yeah, I think we got a lot of questions on international nonprofits, and it's really a research question still. And I'd love to see a group of funders get together to fund some research to figure out how we would even ask these questions. And we'd be very happy to host them on the Candid platform. So I'm going to turn back to Joyce with another pre-selected question. So Joyce, many funders want to know how to support nonprofits in collecting demographic data, because even if we don't ask them 100 times, like Candid, we're asked about 100 times a year, and reduce that to one, it's still work, right? So can you share what the Weingart Foundation and other funders in California have done to support their grantees in collecting demographic data? And how are you accessing that data?
Yeah, definitely. So in response again to the survey and focus group findings that we engaged in, we enlisted the support of Kelly Brown to develop a webinar series that addressed the most salient questions and concerns we heard through that process. The series includes a webinar on why demographic data is critical. So helping folks even understand why we're asking and why it's helpful for them given their work. The different tools and taxonomies that they could potentially access, a webinar on collection strategies, and then another webinar on how to actually use the data once you collect it. And as part of our campaign, we were also directing partners to the suite of tools that Candid offers, because we were directing them to submit their data through the GuideStar platform. And, obviously you guys have put a lot of work into it, and we found them very helpful for our grantee partners to be able to use like the survey, instruments and whatnot that you provide. As far as accessing the data, again, like we're in the process, we at the Weingart Foundation of, creating a GMS system or realigning one so that we would be able to draw down that data through API. But right now, Candid has been a great partner in just providing us the information that they have for the EINs that we provide to them. And, as far as what we are doing with it, like I said, I think as we near the end of our fiscal year, we'll definitely begin to analyze the data in the aggregate as part of a reflection on our grant making portfolio. And I think exactly the data that you provide earlier, Kat, around the disparities between white-led and BIPOC-led, size, grant size, et cetera, are definitely the types of things that we could potentially use and to analyze our own work and how we're, living through our mission. And, what are we, I think Akilah mentioned all of this stuff about pay equity and nonprofit staff burnout, which we hear on a daily basis through our due diligence and site visits. And so how can we use this data to help us understand how our funding practices are contributing to that? So I'll stop there. I think that's what I have for that.
Thank you so much, Joyce. It's great to see the leadership Weingart has really taken in this space. I'm going to turn to a couple questions from our live audience here from the Q&A. Feel free to keep adding questions. I think our staff is trying to answer some of them in the Q&A directly. But one of the questions was, as a public charity, it does feel like we are completing demographic information surveys for all of our funders on a regular basis, but not sure what funders do with this data. We have this same question ourselves. Are there efforts you know of to encourage funders to publicly disclose the demographic information about their grantees? This might encourage more culture change to support leadership pipelines to address the nonprofit racial leadership gap. We also need a similar effort for government funders to disclose this information, which they also regularly collect but do not disclose publicly. I was wondering, Huilan, maybe if you might have any thoughts on that, because I think the work of the data equity work group is related to this.
Absolutely. The work group's charge were our own self-defined purposes. One of the goals is to actually create some sort of common data practices and also standards for data use, and disclosing the grantee organizations' demographic data is part of that, but we have to be careful to balance between protecting the grantees' information, the data, and disclosing the data as aggregated for transparency. So we have to be really careful in our next phase of the work group's work in terms of identifying what are the promising or best practices of using the data while protecting the grantees' confidentiality. So it's in the discussion, but specific actions are still to be coming.
Great. And looking forward to the work of the data equity workgroup. I think it's so important. I have another question from the Q&A for Cat. Will Candid ultimately have the ability to disaggregate data by BIPOC-led, BIPOC serving, and BIPOC-led and BIPOC serving organizations? And I know, Cat, you wrote a great blog post about why it's so hard to define any of these terms.
Yes, I think, right, like it's easy to get in the weeds of like, what is the definition, right, of BIPOC-led, BIPOC serving? And I will say one of the things that we are learning is that the definition also changes the results, right? So just like Hubang was saying, like definitions matter, make sure you know what your definitions are. But yes, the short answer is yes. We do have information on BIPOC CEOs, boards, senior staff members, so whatever your definition is. And we also, through our PCS or taxonomy, collects data about which orgs serve BIPOC communities as well. And so it is possible, although I will say it takes a bit of work, right? Because you do have to merge lots of different data sets and do lots of analysis to get there. But that is ultimately definitely a direction we hope to be able to go, and especially as we get more data and some of these processes become a bit smoother.
Yeah, and I think some of the efforts like the coalition being formed in California are really kind of working together with different funders in the same region or same issue area to get that critical mass of data so that we can do that more in-depth analysis. I did see a question earlier also about whether Candid is going to be putting together a tool to help nonprofits in collecting this data. We also hear about this a lot, that it's actually a lot of work to collect the data, especially from your boards. And so we actually did deploy a pilot of a survey tool last year and are now putting it in our product pipeline to develop something more robust to be used more broadly, because we think that is also something that will help nonprofits, be able to collect this data and not all have to reinvent the wheel over and over again by creating a survey tool. One more question, I think, before we run out of time for questions. For Cat, you shared information about CEOs of nonprofits. What does the data show about the boards of nonprofits?
Awesome question. Yes, I focus largely on CEOs just for the sake of time. We do have information about boards. We have done a lot of that analysis. A lot of that analysis is actually going to be in a report that my team is putting out probably in the next month or so stay tuned. But I will say, so first of all, what we're seeing in the board data is that fewer organizations share comprehensive information about their boards. I think there's probably some education to do there, some like extra steps, right? Like you might have demographics about your CEO, but not about your board. So that data is a bit less complete. But what we're seeing is honestly some of the same patterns as for the CEO, but even more stark. So the haves and have-nots, the racial disparities, the gaps are largely larger when we're looking at board composition compared to CEO.
Yeah, so everybody stay tuned for all the incredible research that's going to be coming out from Kat and her team over the course of the year. And with that, I think we are at time in terms of taking on new questions. I did want to flag that it looks like Kelly Brown is in the audience and gave some great insights in the Q&A and the answered questions if anyone wants to take a look at her thoughts there about some privacy concerns. She's really the world's expert on this topic here. So glad to have her with us and glad to have her input in framing our demographic questions, as well as some research she did that's really helped us understand some of the barriers that nonprofits face so that we can continue to evolve our offering here. So I want to thank all of our panelists and partners and everyone who's attending today. We really appreciate all of the commitment you guys have shown to equity in the sector. And I hope for those of you who aren't already Demographics via Candid partners that you'll consider joining us and joining this movement. Please visit candid.org/DVC. You can also find the link in the chat as well as in email. And you can also reach out to partnerships@candid.org to learn more about signing on as a Demographics via Candid partner. So thank you again, everybody, for participating. And thank you again, in particular, to our fantastic panelists and Akilah for giving the keynote.